I would like to start with the Georgia-US relations issue. In the context of the recent very, very intensive correspondence from Washington, from the congressmen who are publishing letters and sending them to the Georgian Prime Minister. And this correspondence arose different kinds of questions in the society, including about US-Georgia relations in general. What could you tell Georgian citizens about the US government's attitude towards this country and its challenges also?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. It raises a lot of interest, I know, among the Georgian people about what is going on in the nature of US-Georgian relations if there are people from the American Congress, our parliament, who are sending letters to the Prime Minister. One of the great things about a thriving democracy like ours or like the democracy in Georgia is that you have a lot of people with great interest in everything that you do. In the United States and in our Congress, there's great support for Georgia, particularly as Georgia undertakes some very big moves in democracy, becoming a thriving democracy, having an active civil society that engages as one of the key stakeholders in government policy. In the United States, we too have a thriving democracy, and we have three distinct branches of our government. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And our legislative branch is represented by the congressmen and senators whom you reference, who are very engaged in advocating for good US-Georgian relations and for good, solid policies coming out of the executive branch of Georgia as well as out of the Georgian parliament. They operate independently and separately from the executive branch, which I represent as a representative of the Trump administration at the U.S. Agency for International Development. We're happy to hear that members of our Congress are very concerned about the nature of operations of things going on in Georgia, but their interest is the interest of them and their constituents who vote them into office. The executive branch, as I said, operates independently, and we have our lines of engagement with the Georgian government as well, mostly driven by our embassy that's based here in Tbilisi, and our new ambassador who started on the job this week when she arrived in Georgia.
You met her, as I know.
I met her. I know.
Where was that meeting?
I met her before she came to Tbilisi. She came to my office, and then yesterday when I arrived here, I met her in her office. So it was a good bilateral exchange between the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Department of State, our foreign ministry. So our ambassador is in charge of the executive branch relations, and there's responses that come from the embassy to members of Congress, as I'm sure there are responses that come from the Georgian Prime Minister to very interested U.S. members of Congress.
Sometimes when looking at the US-Georgia relations, some people think that NDI and IRI polls are some kind of instruments, some people, some parties, I would say, instruments of the US government to kind of manipulate with the public opinion in Georgia as they wish. So what would you say? How do these organizations relate to the government or vice versa? Or
So NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and IRI, the International Republican Institute, are NGOs. They operate separately and distinctly from the United States government. They are funded in part and at times by the U.S. Agency for International Development, but the bulk of their funding comes from something in the United States called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a non-governmental organization. I understand that NDI and IRI have faced criticism here in Georgia, and I think that criticism is unfounded. At the same time, I know that it can be confusing to some people. So perhaps I'll take a moment to describe what I view as the importance of the operations and engagement of civil society organizations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in the advancement of democracy initiatives in Georgia. The U.S.-Georgia relationship is extremely important to the United States, so much so that we want to ensure that the progress that Georgia has made toward advancing its democratic aspirations are sustainable. That comes to things like democratic elections. I know that Georgia has parliamentary elections coming up in October of this year. But it also goes to to information, civil society, free media, engagement of the Georgian civil society along with international NGOs. And so organizations like NDI and IRI, as well as the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, are critical partners of the US government as well as of the Georgian government to ensure that there's transparency and good governance as Georgia advances democratically. They're here not as agents of the US government, they're here as partners and stakeholders who have a great interest, as do we, in Georgia's advancement democratically.
You mentioned elections, coming elections in Georgia. Last October, the USAID launched a big election program, which is planned for several years to be implemented by many stakeholders. And it's very good that many of them are local organizations, of course. But the context then was different. It was a time when the country and also country's friends outside were expecting particular legislative changes that would have made some kind of fundament for the fully proportional elections in Georgia. But reality has changed. I mean, it did not turn to become a reality. Would it impact somehow the election program of the USAID in Georgia?
I don't think that it will impact the USAID program in Georgia. I think that nobody can want democracy more than the citizens of Georgia. We cannot want it more than the Georgians do themselves. And from everything that I'm hearing during my time here, the Georgians are hungry for democracy and for democratic institutions. The proportional elections is an issue for Georgia to determine. I understand that no matter what, Georgia is in train to have fully proportional elections, certainly by 2024. And I understand too that there are international advisors, including the United States and the European Union, to advise the Georgian government on how they reach a better array of options for proportional representation in the Georgian parliament. These are important steps to take. It's significant to note that Georgian leaders saw the importance of proportional elections to the extent that they were willing to incorporate that in the plan toward democratic advancement to happen by as late as 2024. And our hope is that the Georgian leadership will undertake important reforms that take into account a responsiveness to their own citizens. And international stakeholders, the United States, the European Union, are here to assist the Georgian leadership and Georgian civil society to get to the right place that works for the Georgian people as it travels along a path toward democracy.
One of the hungry for democracy citizen, one of my interviewees just several days ago told me that the most painful thing for him, he's a lecturer and activist at the same time, is when he meets his students or former students and these young people tell him that they don't see any opportunities here in this country for themselves, and that they are looking for some ways to leave the country. How the Yes Georgia program would help young people in changing their views in this term, and who this program is for which part of young people and women in Georgia, and what are the results envisaged of this program?
That's a great question. The Yes Georgia program started in 2015 with a focus on youth entrepreneurs to represent a broad array of young people from across all parts of Georgia, to include the areas that are occupied by Russia. The Yes Georgia program that we launched today is designed to incorporate in the second 2.0, Yes Georgia 2.0, to engage not just young people, but also women entrepreneurs. The idea here is to take into account that women are strong economic drivers in the societies where they're given an opportunity to drive the economy. And sometimes all it takes is a little bit of training or a little bit of seed funding to get entrepreneurs started. We've seen that in the United States, and we have a very vibrant entrepreneurial culture in our country. We see that the excitement around economic development certainly extends to young entrepreneurs and to women entrepreneurs in Georgia. The 2.0 program of Yes Georgia that we launched is designed specifically to focus on women, not just young women, but women entrepreneurs who are entering the entrepreneurship space perhaps after having taken a break to raise their families, or to at least get their children into school, freeing up a little bit more time during their days. And so having a program that focuses on women is very much in line with the Trump administration's focus on women's global development and prosperity. This is an initiative, Women's Economic Empowerment, that was launched by Ivanka Trump as soon as President Trump was elected into office in 2017. We're so excited to have Georgia.
So Georgian women were at the presentation.
Georgian women were at the launch
in
2017, and now we see that it's coming to Georgia to focus specifically also on women's entrepreneurship. There are areas of focus. One is to encourage women to become entrepreneurs. One area of focus is to create an enabling environment for women to be able to gain access both to financing as well as to economic opportunities in Georgia. And we're so looking forward to seeing that economic enabling environment structured in a way that encourages young people, young women, all women, to participate in the economy. We do believe that this will help to stem the flow of out-migration so that people will see that there are economic opportunities available to them at home. This is a program that will start with $840,000 US for Yes Georgia 2.0. So new funding of $840,000 to support 2,500 entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, to gain access to those markets, to gain an understanding of the legal environment and the financing environment that will help them to build and to grow their businesses, to become job creators in Georgia, to create the opportunities for Georgians and for the Georgian economy to thrive.
And another very important sphere of the country's life is education. And almost a week ago we learned that the USAID started $7 million education program, Achieving Student-Centered Education for a New Tomorrow. Very important and challenging part of our lives, primary education. And it's very important to have the significant help for the country in this sphere too. I would like to pay your attention also to the initiative that has been launched last summer. It's a malign Kremlin influence, countering malign Kremlin influence, where Georgia is involved. And my question would be, what do you think is necessary for this initiative to be successful?
So I'll touch very briefly on the education and basic education and how it is a priority for the U.S. Agency for International Development. You need to have a foundational level of competency for children in order for them to be able to succeed in secondary and then university education and to engage in their society. So that's the first part of your question. The next part is something that we think about a lot. How do you counter the malign influences that are coming out of the Kremlin that we see so forcefully in place in Georgia? Efforts to undermine Georgian institutions, efforts to undermine the Georgian economy, efforts to undermine the Georgian democracy. And this is an area where the United States is willing to be outspoken and to partner with Georgian partners to fight against the disinformation that's coming out of the Kremlin. It's not an area that people think of as being particularly sexy or headline grabbing when we talk about good governance and transparency and media transparency. It's not something that makes headlines, but for us it's something that if it's not in place will create headlines, and they won't be good headlines that we want to read. There will be headlines that read things like democracy in Georgia is undermined, democracy in Georgia is threatened, and these are headlines that we don't want to see. So we work with Georgian institutions, civil society, and the Georgian government to find ways to counter the disinformation that's coming out of the Kremlin, to counter the influence, undue influence that Kremlin operatives may have in Georgia, whether it's in the media or in government. It's important for Georgians to know that this is their society. They are occupied by Russian occupiers in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are areas where we in the United States are very concerned that Georgian citizens don't have the right to exercise their democratic freedoms, and they're under attack by Russia. So
and exercise their fundamental rights just every day.
Fundamental rights of a democracy.
Sure.
These are areas that are so important for Georgians to know that they have a right and that we're not afraid to talk about it with them. So it's of significant importance to us. We invest time, we invest funding in efforts for civil society, for government, and for independent media to thrive at a time when Georgia, we feel, along with other countries, is under attack by these malign Kremlin influences.
When the USAID develops its strategy for next several years, what is it based on? How do you determine priorities? I know it's a long and complicated, complex process, but still things are changing in the countries like Georgia, in every country, but especially in developing countries like Georgia. Is it changing also the strategy, or is it flexible, or how does it work? Especially election year is very hard to foresee what would happen, how things will change, what will be the next challenges for our society.
It's how to plan out a financing and a funding strategy across multiple years is more complicated for us in the United States than it used to be under the Soviet Union with 5-year plans that were quite regimented. Ours are much more flexible, but they take into account the reality of who the parties are and who the stakeholders are for engagement. One of the things that we've seen over the course of Georgia rolling out democratic processes is the importance of the private sector. And Georgia has a thriving private sector, a thriving agricultural sector, a thriving economy, thriving tourism. All of these are important factors to take into account when thinking about planning for Georgia's economic development. We know that there's never going to be enough money in the world coming out of any single government, particularly my own, to finance all of the needs in Georgia or any other emerging market. The only way that we're going to solve problems and create solutions is by engaging hand in glove with the private sector. The private sector has incentives and is based on market forces that will allow Georgia to advance, that will allow Georgia to create new jobs, to create tax revenues, and to operate transparently and responsibly, and as well as responsively, to its own citizen community. And so working with the private sector and entities in the private sector is the way that we foresee the next several years of USAID's programming in Georgia. The other component that's very important to engage with is the Georgian government. We are a government agency, and it's important to engage with our counterparts in the Georgian government. And finally, it's critically important to engage with civil society. So civil society, which people often think about as being NGOs, also includes foundations, also includes media outlets, and it's an important stakeholder base for us to work with very closely. In terms of where the funding goes, that's something that changes gently and not without predictability over the course of time. USAID starts projects and we run them for multiple year sequences so that there's never a sudden shock with a cutoff of funding. What we do in our programming is engage with the stakeholders so that we can determine as we go along what are the best ways to gear our funding. It's not didactic. It's not USAID saying, you shall do work this way and only this way. It's USAID taking into account that there are going to be changing parameters over the course of the time of a project. You never know how stakeholders will be impacted. I had the great pleasure yesterday of visiting a group home for severely disabled children, for example. We started this program only a year ago in December, and you don't know how successful or how unsuccessful a program that deals with severely disabled children will be until you see how it progresses over time. And I will say that going and visiting the children in this group home yesterday, which is a home for 7 children with physical and cognitive disabilities, was a true pleasure to see how these children are thriving and engaging and excited and playing and feeding themselves and doing things that they weren't able to do just 1 year ago when they arrived in this group home is really, really exciting. And it's with an eye toward being able to provide a stable family environment for these children once they've been rehabilitated and able to interact in the way that children without similar disabilities are able to is incredibly encouraging. So we didn't know where that would go 1 year ago. We have several more years to go, and then we'll look at ways to find funding moving forward for the next iteration of that program. But you have to plan these things and then be prepared to adapt.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.